There is a man who stood in Brazilian courtrooms for decades, a licensed attorney whose whole living depended on strangers finding him credible and who was, at the same time, the most famous alien abductee in his country's history. Those two facts belong to the same person. Antônio Vilas-Boas spent the second half of his life as a lawyer, a professional believer, while carrying the single most damaging story a man in that position could possibly carry. That one night in 1957, out in a field, he was taken aboard a craft by small gray beings and made to do something no respectable man would ever invent about himself. That collision is the whole reason this case is different, so keep his profession in mind through everything that follows. He had every reason on earth to take the story back, and every opportunity, and he never did, not once, in 34 years. By the end, that refusal is the strangest piece of evidence in the whole file. On the night of October 15th, 1957, Antônio Vilas-Boas was 23 and plowing a field near São Francisco de Sales, in Minas Gerais, in the rural interior of Brazil. He was working at night to avoid the heat of the day, an ordinary detail worth holding on to, because everything about this man before that night is ordinary. A farmer's son, not educated yet. No reader of the science fiction that barely existed in rural Brazil in the 1950s, and at that point, there was essentially no such thing in the culture as a standard abduction story for him to copy. The template did not exist. He would help invent it. He described a red star in the sky that grew as it came closer, until it was a rounded, egg-shaped craft with a red light at the front and a rotating dome on top, coming down into his field on 3 legs. He tried to drive away on his tractor. The engine and the lights died after a few yards. Keep that stalled tractor, because it does a specific kind of work later. When the whole thing was over and he came back to it, he found the battery wires pulled loose. Somebody, at some point that night, had reached into the machine and disconnected it, a strange thing to find and a stranger thing to invent, because it implies abductors who understood a combustion engine well enough to disable one, and because a young man making up a tale does not usually sabotage his own equipment to back it up. It is the kind of small, checkable, off-to-the-side detail hoaxes rarely bother with, and that outlasts the parts of a story you can argue about. He ran on foot. He was caught. 4 beings about 5 feet tall, in gray coveralls and helmets, small-eyed, communicating in what he could only call barks or growls, took hold of him and pulled him inside. And what he described inside is the part that made him, for the rest of his life, a man people laughed at. They stripped him and covered him head to foot in a strange gel. They took him into a semicircular room with red symbols over the doorway, symbols he said he memorized and later drew for investigators, and drew blood from his chin, 2 small cuts. And then, after he was left alone a while, and a gas of some kind made him ill, a woman came into the room, humanoid, but not human, pale hair, blue eyes, the same animal sounds. And what happened next is the thing the whole case is usually reduced to, so I am going to handle it exactly once, plainly, and move on, because the sensational version is everywhere, and the sober version is the one that matters. She was there to be bred from him. The encounter was physical, and it was not, by his account, something he initiated or fully controlled. And when it was over, she pointed at her own belly, and then upward, at the ceiling, at the sky, a gesture he took, and was tormented by for years, to mean that whatever they had made would be raised somewhere else. Then he was dressed, shown around the craft, and set back out in his field, gone, by his own reckoning, about 4 hours and 15 minutes. Sit with that beat for a second, not for the reason you think. Forget the strangeness of it, and think about what it did to him as a claim. Of all the stories a man could carry out of a field, this is the single worst one for his standing, and it invites exactly the smirk you are probably fighting right now. That is why it matters. It is the detail that guaranteed ridicule, the one no man angling for credibility would ever attach to his own name. A hoaxer building a story to be believed reaches for dignity the noble contactee met by wise beings with a message for mankind, which was the going template of the era. He does not invent his own humiliation. Vilas-Boas told the one version guaranteed to cost him. Hold that, because his whole life afterward keeps making the same choice. If that were the whole of it, a lurid story from a young farmhand alone in a field, you would be right to dismiss it, and almost everyone did. But it is not the whole of it. And this is where the case stops being a story and starts being a problem. Because his body changed, and other people saw it. In the days and weeks after that night, Vilas-Boas got sick, and stayed sick, in a way a lie does not produce. Nausea, headaches, a constant burning in his eyes, loss of appetite, and on his skin, appearing over months, small reddish nodules harder than the surrounding skin, raised, painful, each with a tiny central opening that wept a thin yellowish fluid, ringed by violet-tinged discoloration. These were not bruises he could have made in an evening. They came up over weeks, on his arms, legs, and face, long after the night was over, and left purple marks that stayed for months. This is the hinge of the entire case. More than 4 months after that night, in February of 1958, Vilas-Boas traveled several hundred miles to Rio de Janeiro to be examined by Dr. Olavo Fontes of the National School of Medicine of Brazil, not a fringe UFO enthusiast, but a working doctor at a serious teaching institution. Fontes and a journalist cross-examined the young farmer for more than 4 hours, hunting for the seams, and gave him a full physical. And Fontes came away with a finding he could not make go away. He documented the symptoms as consistent with a dose of radiation, mild radiation sickness, from an exposure he could not otherwise source. He looked at the 2 small lesions on the chin, where the beings had supposedly drawn blood, and at the violet halos ringing the nodules on the arms and legs, and wrote plainly that he had no ordinary medical explanation for them. No local disease, no known condition, no injury the young man could have given himself. And these were not fading marks by then. They had been erupting in waves for months, long after any single night could account for them, in a pattern this physician had never encountered. Photographs were taken. A report was compiled and circulated to colleagues in Brazil and abroad. Psychological testing came back the same way, inconvenient for the easy answer. No delusion, no mental illness, no sign of a man detached from reality. A sane, grounded young farmer, physically unwell in a way that resisted explanation, telling a consistent story without hypnosis of any kind. And the marks were not only on his skin. Out in the field, his family found deep impressions in the plowed earth where the 3 legs had pressed down, heavy enough to register in the soil. And there were the symbols, the red characters, he said, were written above the doorway inside the craft, which he claimed to have memorized in the moment and reproduced, by hand, for the investigators. A frightened liar improvises. He does not, as a rule, commit an invented alphabet to memory under terror and reproduce it on demand for a hostile examiner months later. Hold on to that last phrase, because it separates this case cleanly from the famous ones that came after. There was no hypnosis here. Nothing was recovered under a trance by a suggestive voice. He told the same detailed account awake, in daylight, under hostile cross-examination by a doctor and a journalist trying to catch him out, and it held together. Whatever else you make of Antônio Vilas-Boas, his memory was not manufactured on a couch. He simply said what he said and kept saying it. And then he did the thing that reframes the entire case, the choice that makes him different from every hoaxer who ever lived. He went quiet and built a respectable life directly on top of the story that should have made one impossible. He did not sell it the fact most people never hear. There was money and fame available to a man with a story like this, especially once the abduction phenomenon exploded in the 1960s, and he reached for none of it. He finished school through correspondence courses, studied law, became a practicing attorney, married, had children, and for decades refused to discuss the thing at all, turning away journalists, and by many accounts not even telling his own family. He broke his silence essentially once, on Brazilian television in 1978, and only to correct inaccurate versions of his own story. He held it steady, without embroidery, without cashing it in, from 23 until his death in 1991. Think about what that costs, a man who argues for a living. A lawyer's entire instrument is his credibility. His single professional asset is that when he speaks, reasonable people believe him. And every courtroom Vilas-Boas entered carried the same quiet risk, that someone across the aisle knew that the counsel making this argument is the farmer from the newspapers, the one who says he was taken up into a craft and bred like livestock. There is no worse biography for a man in that trade, the kind of thing that ends careers, that a rival could drop into a room to sink you without saying a word. And here's the part that should stop you. He could have made it vanish at any moment, permanently, with 3 words: "I made it up." That sentence would have cost him nothing and bought back everything: his dignity, a clean professional name. Every incentive pointed toward saying it. He never said it. Not at 30, building the practice. Not at 40, established. Not ever. He carried the most ruinous story a professional could carry straight through the one career where being believed is the entire job, and for 34 years refused to set it down, though setting it down was the easiest thing in the world, and he, above all people, understood exactly what holding on to it cost him. The strongest argument against him is about timing, and it is a good one. In November of 1957, weeks after the night in the field, a popular Brazilian magazine called O Cruzeiro was running UFO articles by João Martins, the journalist Vilas-Boas would later write to. His story only reached the public in 1958. So, a skeptic can build a clean explanation. A young man reads the coverage, is captivated, and backdates an imagined experience to make it look independent of the magazine. Add the contactee stories drifting through the culture that decade, and you have an account that needs no craft and no beings at all. That is a serious argument, and it explains a great deal. But it runs into a wall the moment you ask what, exactly, he was supposed to have copied. Because this case came first, the magazine articles in O Cruzeiro were about lights in the sky, flying saucers, sightings, the contactee stories of the era, in which friendly space brothers deliver messages of peace to willing witnesses. There was no template in 1957 for what Vilas-Boas described: being seized against his will, dragged aboard, stripped, examined, sampled for blood, and bred. That entire grammar of the involuntary medical abduction, the thing his account is built from, did not exist in the popular culture yet. The famous Betty and Barney Hill case, the one that fixed the abduction and examination narrative in the public mind, was still 4 years in the future. Vilas-Boas was not copying the abduction script. He is one of the reasons the abduction script later existed. You cannot plagiarize a page that has not been written, and in 1957, the page was blank. And even granting the skeptic everything about the timing, it still does not explain the 2 things at the center. It does not explain the medicine. The lesions were real. Fontes was a real physician at a real institution who examined a real body and found photographed, documented wounds he could not source to any ordinary cause, erupting over months in a pattern he had not seen before. A young man who reads a magazine and decides to lie does not thereby grow weeping radiation-type lesions on his arms and legs for months afterward. The story you could copy from O Cruzeiro. The nodules on your skin, you could not. And it does not explain the incentives. The timing argument requires Vilas-Boas to be a liar, so look at how he behaved for the next 34 years and ask what kind of liar this is. A liar seeks the payoff. A hoaxer exposed to decades of ridicule, with money and fame right there for the taking, cashes in, or cracks, or quietly retracts to save his name when the joke stops being worth it. Vilas-Boas did the opposite of every one of those things. He took no money, sought no fame, fled the attention, and built a career in the one field where his story was pure liability and still would not disown it. Whatever happened in that field, the man's behavior does not read like invention. It reads like burden, a weight he would gladly have put down if only he had been the one who picked it up. I cannot stand here and swear to you that a craft landed in a field in Minas Gerais in 1957 and that its crew bred a Brazilian farmer for their own purposes. The account contains things no evidence can reach, and the sexual core of it is exactly the kind of detail a certain skeptic will say a young man's imagination is most likely to produce. And I cannot honestly hand you the inside of that craft as fact. But the outside of it is a different matter. Keep only the parts that left a mark on the world, the parts a lie cannot fake, and you are left with a young, uneducated man with no template to copy, whose tractor was found with its wires pulled loose, whose skin erupted for months in wounds a serious doctor could not explain, whose mind a psychologist found entirely sound, and who then spent the rest of his life proving by his every choice that he had everything to lose by keeping the story alive, and kept it alive anyway. And he understood the cost, because he paid it every day. In 1978, on that one television appearance, an older man now, settled, respectable, with every reason to laugh it off and walk away clean, he was asked about the night in the field, and he did not soften it, and he did not take it back. He described it the way he had at 23, steadily, without embroidery, the account of a man who was not selling anything, and had long since stopped, hoping to be believed. He died in 1991, having practiced law, raised a family, and never once profited from the strangest night any Brazilian farmer ever claimed to survive. The lesions are in a doctor's report. The disconnected wires are in his testimony, and the recantation that would have cost him nothing and freed him from a lifetime of ridicule, the 3 easy words every hoaxer eventually reaches for, never came. He took the story into a courtroom career, and then into the ground, exactly as he first told it, in a field, at 23, with the mud still on his hands.